Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Midlands Evaluation Showcase panel discussions brought to you by the Midlands Regional Network of the UK Evaluation Society. My name is Carl King, and I'm convener of the Midlands Network, which aims to connect and support evaluators and those working with evaluation evidence in the Midlands region. I'm also a director at Winning Moves, who I would like to thank for agreeing to host the discussions this morning. We're delighted to bring you two panel discussions today, both of which will be on the theme of evaluation in the context of a pandemic. In the first discussion, which will start in a few minutes' time, we will be taking a look back over the last few months and asking our panelists to reflect back and share experiences from the evaluations that they were conducting as the UK first went into lockdown. We'll be asking them about the challenges they encountered, how they sought to overcome these, and the lessons that they learnt in the process. After a short comfort break around 10:55, we will then commence the second of our two discussions, this time looking forwards and asking our panelists to consider on the day we enter a second national lockdown in England, the ongoing implications of the pandemic for the evaluation community. In the latter half of each panel discussion, there will be opportunity for you to pose questions to any or all of our panel members. So if you have a question that you'd like to raise, or even just an experience you'd like to share, please open the Q&A chat window and post it there so we can pose it to our panel. I can't promise that we'll be able to cover all of your questions, but we'll do our best to cover as many as we can. So in a moment or two, I'll be handing over to Tracy Wand, who will be chairing the first discussion. Before I do that, I'd just like to thank our panelists for the time that they spent ahead of the discussions today in preparing the video and written contributions that I hope many of you attending today will have had a chance to take a look at on the Showcase website. If you haven't done so and would like to hear more about some of the evaluations our panelists discussed today, you will still be able to access the Showcase contributions after the event by visiting the Showcases page on midlandsevaluationshowcase.wordpress.com, which is the same site you visited to register for the discussions today. I'd also like to say, if you're working in the Midlands and haven't done so already, please do reach out and connect with us. The best way to do that is to join our LinkedIn group or get in touch with me directly so I can invite you to join us. I'll share details about that at the end of the session. So if all the panelists and chairs for the first session could please turn on their cameras, I will stop sharing slides and we will make a start. Thank you.
Hi Carl, if you could just enable us to unvideo ourselves. I certainly haven't got access to turn my video on, but I am here. Good morning, everybody. I'm Tracy Wand. I'm a network member and I run Higher Education Impact and Evaluation Research Higher. I'm chair for this panel and I'm joined by Hamayoun Sultan, who's also runs our network with us as co-chair.
Hello, I'm here.
Hi, how are you? Carl, I'm not sure if my video, it says my host won't disable my video, so I don't know if you're able to turn that back on for me. So I'd first like to introduce you to our first panel. I'm delighted to introduce you to our first panel. And this is on the topic reflecting backwards on the challenges created by the pandemic for evaluations that were live as lockdown measures were introduced at 1.0. The actions taken in response and the lessons learned. And I'm delighted now to welcome the panelists. And we have Adam Knight Markegi, who is Research Director of MER Research. And if you've watched the videos, you'll be able to have seen and had an introduction from our panelists. Adam will be sharing his experience from evaluating making connections Walsall, which is a social return investment ROI analysis of a social prescribing programme. We're also joined by Anne Green. Anne is a Professor of Regional Economic Development at the City Region Economic Development Institute, which is City Ready. You may have heard a bit more easily by City Ready, and that's the University of Birmingham. And Anne will talk about her experiences from evaluating a neighbour-based employment support initiative. I'd also like to welcome Matthew Horton, who's Widening Participation Research Manager, NCOP and Access Agreement at the University of Birmingham. And he'll discuss his experiences from undertaking a quasi-experimental evaluation of the AIM Higher programme, which is a multi-intervention widening participation programme. And finally, Matthew Terry, and Matthew's a network member as well, as a evaluation specialist at Cloud Chamber. And he'll be drawing on his experiences of evaluating Brushstrokes, which is a community-based project in the West Midlands, which supports refugees, asylum seekers, and other vulnerable migrants. Hi, everyone. So we have a selection of questions which touch upon the theme of looking backwards on the pandemic and the impact that had on evaluations. And I'd first like to begin by asking our panelists how the pandemic affected the evaluation that they submitted for the showcase. And if we take our panelists in order, first of all, and we'll see how it goes from there, I think that might work fine. So Adam, how did the pandemic affect the evaluation that you submitted for the showcase?
Hi Tracy, I think unfortunately Adam's having some technical issues, so he'll be joining us shortly, hopefully.
Oh, no problem,
Not able to
no problem.
Just
we'll pop Anne in the hot seat then. Anne, I hope you're with us. Could you talk to us about the effect that the pandemic had on your evaluation that you submitted for the showcase?
Yes, hello everyone. As has been outlined, the thing that I submitted was about a neighbourhood-based employment support initiative. And as the lockdown 1.0 hit, we were entering the second year of this. So actually, we'd established relationships with, there were 9 separate providers in 9 separate neighbourhoods. We'd done that, we'd established the relationships. So I think really what happened, I mean, I think one of the biggest things I would point to is the context for the whole evaluation changed. This neighbourhood-based employment support initiative had a payment by results model. So the providers delivering this employment support initiative, they got paid on the basis of participants being embedded in the programme, job starts, which obviously had an impact during lockdown, sustaining employment and progression. So actually the funder changed the payment by results model to some extent, just so that the providers could kind of keep afloat and continue working. So that, importantly, the context changed. And I think also some of this was a neighbourhood-based employment support model, which was very physical, very face-to-face, very relational. So it was really about getting out there, being visible, being seen. And I think obviously that had a huge effect on the activities that we were evaluating. But also because this is a neighbourhood-based employment support initiative, it very much depended on local networks. And some of the partners and the local partners, their priorities changed. If you take some community support initiatives, they kind of just stopped delivering. Others became more important. People like Job Centre Plus are very important in an employment support initiative. Its priorities altered. So I think what I would really point to that affected our evaluation was very much the whole context that we were looking at changed, and we had to deal with that. So I'll stop there.
That's a great introduction. Thank you very much, Anne. Matthew, would you like to introduce the evaluation you submitted for your showcase in terms of how the pandemic affected it?
Sorry, which Matthew?
Sorry, Matthew Horton, sorry.
Okay, I'll go for it. Okay, yeah, so the programme that I'm evaluating is the AIM Higher programme. And essentially what this programme aims to do, it works with disadvantaged learners in schools and aims to increase their participation in higher education, because there's obviously quite a few gaps with different demographic, socioeconomic groups. They're getting the attainment, but they're not going to higher education. In terms of the evaluation that was submitted, lucky enough, the evaluation ran over a number of phases, and the first phase was completed just before the pandemic, and it relied on the evaluation relied on a lot of secondary data, really. So we were tracking pupils' engagement in different AIMHAR activities via the AIMHAR database. And then against that, we were looking at their HE entry rates. So there was a lot of secondary data. So we were quite lucky we had that data there already to do the analysis, which was the second phase, which began just after March. So yeah, really we were quite lucky there, but it did cause problems in obtaining some of the data. So for the analysis, we've obviously had quite a few controls, measures, so data on ethnicity, gender, and different measures like that, but it made it difficult to get hold of pupil attainment data, which was an important control. Mainly, it's just difficult to get it for schools, and there's a thing that we can do called an NPD request, National Pupil Database. So you put a request in really to the Department for Education, and the difficulties were, it's just very slow processing that request, and when the request came through, you have to access the data from the kind of nuclear bunkers, really. You can't take anything in with you like phones or anything, and it's all very secure, but a lot of those sites were closed due to the pandemic. So that was one of the big difficulties really that we had. Also, I was working with academics at Aston University on the project, second phase. Then there were like people potentially going down with COVID working on the project. So at certain phases it slowed things down, and now we're at publication stage for a journal now, but there seems to be a lack of editors as well around, or editors that are very, very busy because they've got a backlog. So those are the main challenges really. We were quite lucky that we weren't collecting primary data, so we weren't reliant on surveys, interviews, and things like that. So because it was a lot of secondary data, it probably made things a lot easier. So, okay.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And Matthew Terry.
Hi, and apologies, I'm on my phone. I can't get my laptop to work, so I might look a bit
No problem.
wobbly.
So Matthew, how did the pandemic affect the evaluation that you've submitted for the showcase?
Yeah, this was an evaluation of Brushstrokes, which is a Sandwell-based, Smethwick-based charity that works with refugees and asylum seekers. We've worked with them on several evaluations, several activities over the last few years. So I think we benefited from the fact that we already knew the organisation pretty well and had good relationships with them. I think a number of things that Anne said and Matthew said ring true with me. I think the first one is changing context. You plan an evaluation on what you expect a programme or a project to deliver, and they either, as a consequence of COVID, change what they deliver or change the way in which they deliver. So with Brushstrokes, they were more heavily reliant on volunteers. They became much more proactive, dealing with people who already have very, very little support in communities, are then faced with dealing with the consequences of the pandemic as well, understanding what's going on because language difficulties are always an issue. So the whole context of the evaluation changes because delivery is changing. And the other point is another one that Anne made, I think, which is about communication, which is it's the joy of doing evaluation, I think, is getting under the skin of an organisation or a project, getting close to them, understanding what's going on, and you lose that by working remotely. I think Brushstrokes does very well in collecting its own monitoring data. So the thing that I'd like to think that our evaluations give in terms of added value is the qualitative stories that you can get from people who are supported from the project. And obviously that is much more difficult to do remotely.
Thank you. Yeah. Adam, have we got Adam now? We haven't got Adam yet.
Yes, Adam is here.
Sorry,
Adam?
I've been having technical problems. I think some of my
No
colleagues
problem.
and others have as well. Sorry about that.
No problem, Adam. It's great that you can join us. We have introduced you, so people do know who you are. And we just wanted to kind of kick off with just a bit of an explanation of how the pandemic has affected the evaluation that you submitted for your showcase. So if you could just speak to us about that first.
Yeah, by all means. Yeah, lovely, and thanks for kind of inviting me to this today. I guess probably, as I imagine some others have said, and probably others will say, it's affected things in lots of ways. I guess what I want to kind of use as some of the examples we've been working on recently, particularly kind of Midlands ones, is, if you like, having to both highlight and ignore COVID. And I think that's quite hard because it's kind of looming over all our lives. We're today in England in a second kind of lockdown. But for example, so we've been doing a project, kind of ethnographic kind of research with Warsaw, really looking at kind of healthy child program, working with parents, kind of young parents to be, young people themselves. And of course, COVID is such a big issue right now that it's hard to kind of distract from that, to take it away. However, we know we will get over COVID. It will end at some point, and evaluations, both those looking back and those looking forward, need to kind of bear that in mind. So need to kind of take on board more than just the immediate kind of pressures. So I think kind of one of the big things is about that. How do you both highlight it as a very big issue that's affecting how we all live our lives, but also how do we almost step aside from it, imagine the world before, imagine how the world might be afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's fab. I think there's definitely something there for real life as well, isn't it? We're sort of trying to highlight and ignore all at the same time. It's a bit of a blurred boundary. Great. So thinking on, I mean, and I don't know if you caught Anne's discussion at the beginning. Anne noted around how the context for the evaluation had changed, and I'd quite like to just come back to you really on that. Around you noted that the programme had changed, the way in which the programme was running had changed financially and in other ways. So how did you respond to that in terms of your evaluation?
Well, I suppose we had to adapt in real time as best as possible. And I think what I would underline, it affected us as evaluators. And it's very easy to focus on the beneficiaries of an employment support programme, but you can very often overlook the impact on the staff delivering it. And I think one of the things that I really took away from this was how much, if you've got a job that is really going out, meeting people, delivering face-to-face support, the impact of COVID and that on the staff delivering it. I think it's worth saying, in terms of this particular initiative, as far as possible, the providers delivering employment support went and delivered virtually as much as they possibly could. For us, in terms of how we responded in the evaluation, I think picking up on what Adam has said, we were in a primary data collection phase, and we had to sort of in our data collection instruments kind of have before and after COVID, because we wanted to collect information from sort of September to February, and then we wanted to collect information about what happened from March onwards. So it's kind of, we had to at the outset say we're interested in how it was going up to March and how it went after March. So I think that's an important thing. We were keen to collect both, and so we kind of tried to separate that out. We had to alter some of our questions, and I think also be more open for people to listen to what they wanted to say. So I'd say that as well. And then I think in terms of how did we respond, I think it's fair to say, and we might talk a little bit about this later in the session, I think we found that some people were very keen to talk and some people weren't. And some people just disappeared off the scene because they were furloughed. So in other words, I think what we had to do was we tried to continue virtually. I'll say something a bit later about how we met with providers virtually, but we just ploughed on as best we could virtually with a bit more leeway in terms of timings. MI data collection continued, self-evaluation continued, and we just sort of coped as best we could, all going virtually and trying to be as work through it as best we could, really. So learning by doing, I think, really. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, so definitely some pragmatism in there. It's interesting the sort of level of empathy you just sort of mentioned there. It's something around empathizing with the program, that it's difficult and that's affecting, you know, it's not just about looking at the beneficiaries, but the impact on everybody. Interesting. I noticed Ofsted are carrying on their inspections. They've just announced they're carrying on inspections at the moment. I think the empathy for the teachers or whatever that means. But it's interesting because Matthew, Terry, you also picked up on the relationships and how this will impact potentially how you communicate the evaluation, and you just picked up on a notion of this before COVID and after COVID, and there's a really interesting dilemma in how we communicate and deal with that in the way that we report. And certainly I can imagine quite a few evaluation reports having some very, very interesting wording and communication of kind of pre-COVID and during and post there. I think picking up on that relationship issue, and for Matthew, Terry in particular, because you mentioned that, Matthew, could you talk to us maybe a little bit more about the relationships or the communication? So how are you responding a little bit more to some of these challenges?
Yeah, I think the word empathy is a really interesting and useful one to use. Maybe I call myself a jobbing evaluator, it's really important at all points to realise that you don't always fully understand the context in which someone is operating. So, for example, if I just expand it a bit, we're doing evaluations in healthcare sector, for example. You have to remember when you're conducting interviews in particular that people are operating in completely different environments and very dramatically different environments in the context of COVID. So, you know, just even trying to get to a nurse, to speak to a nurse and getting them to focus on something which over the last 6 months has perhaps not been the most important thing that they've been dealing with, is quite tricky. I think from a sort of practical project management perspective, it means more time speaking to someone often. It involves trying to separate the now from the COVID from the pre-COVID, and that's tricky. Often when we've been interviewing people in a number of projects during COVID, it's COVID that they want to talk about, inevitably. It's very, very stressful, psychologically challenging, very, very exhausting. But the bit we're interested in long-term evaluations is probably the bit that happened before COVID. I mean, talking about the response to COVID, I think, is really important. We might talk about the lessons that have come out of that. Projects surprising themselves about how flexible and innovative they can be when they're put under pressure. But I think separating those two, pre-COVID and COVID, is really quite challenging when you're dealing with interviews, qualitative evidence, trying to get people to separate that. People already, I think some professionals I've spoken to recently, already struggling to remember what pre-COVID looked like. COVID has pushed those experiences out of their minds, and so it does take time to sort of bring them back to that. I think that just one other thing, there's a knock on there for reporting. I think it touches on what Anne said. We're already looking with some clients about reworking reporting schedules, because if we report now, all we're going to talk about is COVID. So, you know, we better running the evaluation longer, so it's not just about COVID. We're learning longer, wider lessons.
Thank you. Thanks. Matthew Horton, you mentioned around the challenges of trying to get the data, particularly when particular archives are closed down and things like that. How have you managed to respond to some of the challenges that you've faced?
Okay, yeah, so like I said, it's kind of, this project was a lot of secondary data analysis. So like I said, we were in a kind of better position with COVID. So what we did have was other program level data. So we had information on pupils' gender, what areas they lived in terms of disadvantage, ethnicity, and different controls like that. And these control measures, characteristics, they tend to be stratified by their attainment does by socioeconomic group anyway. So that was quite helpful for having the gap in terms of attainment, really. So all of that was just chucked into a regression analysis. So there was no way getting around we didn't have the attainment, but we had other measures which were associated. But like everyone else, like if you think about this project I was working on, it was looking backwards anyway. What was the HE entry data for September? We were looking at dosage response as well. So for the previous year, how many times have they engaged? And what was the likelihood of going to university? But going similar to everybody else, all of the project work we're doing now and evaluation, everything just shifted to online. So in some ways it's quite lucky. Schools were still kind of open a little bit for disadvantaged students, and education's still a lot more open now, obviously, because it has to continue. But we have had to go online for delivering activities quite a lot. Some schools don't want staff going into them, other schools are okay. So there's a lot of development work around that as well, in terms of just having monitoring systems online to pick up student engagement, privacy notices, guidance and training for staff, and online evaluation as well. So just evaluation forms online, and we tend to use SurveyMonkey quite a bit for online evaluations. And one issue you do fall into with that, because we evaluate individual activities as well as part of the program. So we do high level analysis, which I was talking about earlier on, but also feedback on each, like we run summer schools and different activities like that to gain feedback. But obviously when you use an online method for evaluation like SurveyMonkey, it's not face-to-face, and the issues are just lower response rates because people feel less obliged to complete questionnaires and things like that. So what we've done across the programme, we've kind of ran prize draws. So if you complete the questionnaire, you'd be put into a prize draw to win some gift vouchers or something like that. So that's been quite helpful in terms of increasing response rates, I think. So, okay.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. It's interesting because all of our panelists work with very different groups of potentially those beneficiaries in the evaluations. It's quite interesting there around the impact of the move online. So we could get into kind of all doom and gloom, and we've had to do this and we've had to do that, and it's been a challenge and it's been really bad. But I kind of want to flip that now and actually look at that. What's been the positives? What have we managed to bring out from this? What has been good? What's worked well? And maybe there's something there about what practice might we continue? Maybe we've realised things for ourselves. That, you know, I know I certainly travelled to far too many meetings that I probably didn't need to travel to. Actually, we've done great online. So was there any positives that have kind of come out? And if we start off first of all by targeting that question at Anne, if there's any positives.
Yes, I'll pick up on one thing that I think has been positive that we did, and one thing that we did prior to COVID. This was an initiative in 9 neighbourhoods, and we used to bring together the 9 neighbourhoods with the evaluation team and the funder in a physical meeting that might last 2 hours, you know, like from 2 till 4, etc. And we would have sort of like a business meeting. We might have some activities. One thing we've done since we've all been virtual is that we have had some of those meetings, but we've had them shorter. We've had them certainly no longer than 90 minutes, whereas it used to be if people were travelling, we would have a longer meeting. We've also had those meetings more focused, and we've sent out a little bit of material in advance for discussion at those meetings. And we've had a short presentation and then invited people to respond in a sort of open discussion. And I think what's worked really well is us focusing down on particular issues that we want to discuss, focusing the meeting on that. And I think what's worked really, really well in a virtual way is that the people who perhaps are less voluble but have things to say have used the chat function in that sort of meeting very effectively, as some people are talking, saying, oh, I agree with this, and we've done X, Y, and Z. And actually, I'm picking out that example because I think actually we've got some richer information of people reacting to each other in real time, because you can type into the chat function as somebody's speaking, whereas you can't just keep interacting. Oh no, I think that's rubbish, or yeah, that's brilliant, and in our place we did that. So I think that's one thing that I think has worked well. Shorter, more focused meetings. I think we have to prepare them very well. I'm not saying we didn't prepare them before, but I think they have to be very focused, very clear what you're looking at, and then using the chat function. And I think that's one thing that's been extremely useful that I would take forward perhaps for the future, and that I probably wouldn't have thought about in the same way if you'd asked me this time last year. So that's just one example that I'll offer for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Is there some, I noticed that your initiative is more around sort of neighbourhood-based initiatives. So are there any issues there with some people having access to particular technologies to do that or not? Has there been any issues maybe there?
Not amongst the providers, but certainly amongst the beneficiaries. There have been issues about some people, that has been a very big issue, and some of the providers have also, and the key workers have been, you know, I suppose telling people how they can use their phone to do certain things. So access to IT is an issue. And obviously for an employment support initiative, if you think about people who have been reliant on going into libraries and other public buildings for access to IT, that's a problem for beneficiaries. It hasn't been so much for the providers, but for some of the people on the programme, it has been an issue. And, you know, and some have used Facebook, some have used new things, but it is obviously an issue when you're thinking about groups that some of them might be quite long-term unemployed, recently unemployed, etc. So yeah, it can work in some instances, but not for everyone. Yeah,
absolutely. I think we take it for granted that we've got our computers and our internet and our printers and various other things. I was at a cafe a few days ago and I overheard somebody saying that how do they update a CV? They don't have a computer, and it just sort of struck me that it's something for me that I just do in a second. It's not an issue. I've got everything there, but for somebody in a different position, absolutely, it's a barrier there that we need to be aware of. Excellent. Right. So Matthew Terry, I've got two Matthews. Matthew, just for you, is there anything that's kind of been actually like this is good, this is actually really benefited in some ways?
I think on brushstrokes we were very lucky to be able to use volunteers to gather evaluation data on our behalf, so that helped. There's always, I think, it's often something that we think about in project evaluations. You have to be a bit careful because you're still wanting to gather evidence objectively. So there's always that sort of philosophical challenge. Not that we don't trust volunteers, but you're asking them to collect evidence for an independent evaluation, but that worked well. With brushstrokes, most of what we did was by phone. Again, I think digital access for some of the beneficiaries would have been quite challenging, although I know the project itself helped with that. Elsewhere, we had we're doing an evaluation with some public engagement professionals, and we set up a Slack channel for collaborative learning during COVID, and also set up monthly drop-in sessions on Zoom. And they have worked really well as a way of, I mean, I'm just touching on things that Anne has already mentioned. They work really well. People are increasingly relaxed on online video conferences, I would say. They share information, files, and information on chat. And that has been a really useful way of keeping in touch with people. I think from an evaluation perspective, because they're sharing stories about how they've changed their delivery during COVID. I think also there's been almost a sort of pastoral value in it, because a lot of these projects work in schools and they've had their projects turned upside down over the last 6 to 8 months. So it's been helpful for them to hear that they're not the only ones struggling. So I think they work very well. I think it's probably not for now, but maybe for later if people are interested, but I think an awful lot of projects and programs have done things really well. The evaluations have been able to show them and demonstrate to them how much they have changed and moved on. But perhaps that's another question.
Right. Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of businesses pivot, but it sounds like we as evaluators have managed to find innovative ways to do things. So that's excellent. I bet there's a lot of apps and things that people were maybe not using before that they're getting quite good on now. We certainly get my gran on Zoom's a big one. Okay, so that's I really like the sense of the kind of innovations that are coming out there. Adam, you mentioned around ethnography, and I wasn't sure if that was involved in the project that you talked about for the showcase or not, but I just wondered around some of those methods that you were using, around whether you've had to shift a little bit. You know, people maybe are doing some levels of self-evaluation, or you've got people engaged in depth for the purposes of ethnography, and whether there's had to be some changes there, and again, whether there's been any good things that we can draw out from that.
Yeah, definitely, and that is like an extra project actually we've been working in Warsaw on top of the social return on investment one I kind of I included earlier. I guess with this one, and the move to kind of virtual, the move to using technology, because we were really engaging with and hearing from and seeing through the eyes of young people. Actually, tech is just, they're tech natives, they're digital natives. So, that was so much easier, so that was, it kind of goes with the territory. Now, if I were to kind of look back and look at the other one, which was really looking at isolation and loneliness among older people, we tried at first to do, this was before the lockdown actually, before COVID, we tried to do telephone engagement, contacting people by email in advance, and the level of kind of wariness about an independent agency that they haven't come across. These are kind of older people in Warsaw that they don't know, didn't help actually, and we therefore had to switch. So again, before COVID, to a face-to-face. So if we were having to do that today, I think we really would struggle actually, because the technology does work for some, but it is much harder for others. And it's not just the kind of you have a smartphone or not, you're feeling comfortable with it, but it is kind of actually getting in front of people in the first place. And even if those gatekeepers that we might often use to kind of get through to somebody, a social prescriber, for example, or a community connector, it could be a voluntary organization lead, if they also aren't engaging with people because they're not online, that then makes it harder for us as somewhat removed from the situation to get in touch. And in the past, where we might be able to go along to a community group and tag along to something that they're doing, those just aren't happening, or they're happening online. But I guess, as Anne said, the amount of time you have for an online meeting is shorter than you do physically. So there's less kind of, padding, if you like, there's less extra time to tap into. So yes, worked very well for kind of young people, but I think we would have struggled doing the same level of engagement with an older group.
Brilliant.
Can I, sorry, Tracy, can I just follow up on that as well? Sort of, because it's a very important point there about sort of how comfortable people are with technology, Adam. Sort of, and it's almost sort of, especially for people who aren't comfortable with it, we get into issues of trust as well, possibly. And I'm just wondering, going forward, I mean, it's a very important point earlier that we will get through this. COVID will end at some point, but technology at some point, because we're becoming more and more used to it, it will be there. So I was wondering about issues of trust as you were talking, and sort of how do we build trust with people through to actually sort of talk to them using this medium as well, that they do become more comfortable in it as well, and try to challenge some of this sort of wariness.
Yeah, I'll kind of talk about that with some other projects. I think that kind of trust, I guess the trust also comes with the kind of empathy, with the engaging with somebody as a human being. And we had two other evaluations that actually that emotional connection was so important. And I think, you know, that emotional connection is therefore so important to identify with somebody, their situation, and then really for them to kind of open up about it. So one actually was a project down south, actually, around kind of homes for health. And for lots of people, because we're asking about their health and well-being, it becomes quite an emotional time for them when we were speaking to them during lockdown. So that level of engagement. And just one other project, again, that touches on this, which really was about trust and empathy. It's a project we've been doing for Buckinghamshire Council, actually, but very specifically about the impact on certain groups through COVID. And there were a few conversations I had with residents that actually, for them, it was a cathartic process. Being able to open up about their kind of anxieties, about how they view the future, whether that's bleakly or positively, about the impact that the lockdown in particular had had on them and their families, being able to open up about that made a big difference. So actually, yeah, I think that, and both of those actually were telephone kind of interviews rather than kind of online. But I could imagine then if I wanted to follow those up using other technology, you know, having a video conversation with them, having kind of connected with them emotionally, really builds that bridge and lets them kind of, you know, you're identifying with them, you're seeing through their eyes as much as you can.
Absolutely, thank you very much. Sort of, yeah, I agree with that completely. It's sort of from an international development perspective myself, it's sort of that trust and empathy thing is absolutely key to what we do, and sort of that's why I asked it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Damian. Yeah, trust is interesting. I've researched and written on trust in evaluation, and it's an interesting line that we cross between empathy and independence. And as we've become a little bit more developmental focused in evaluation, then you know, some of those concerns for independence have perhaps waned a bit more. So it's maybe a better environment for COVID and evaluation that we see today. I want to try and sort of hone the questions down a little bit more into, and by all means, if people want to pop some questions into the Q&As, and we can get these covered, but I wanted to hone the questions down into looking at you as evaluation teams a little bit more specifically, and sort of behaviours and attitudes that are going on there, and as you as individuals. First of all, thinking about the attitudes that might have gone on in your teams, if you don't mind sort of exploring that. But is there an attitude in your teams maybe that we might as not well bother, that it's all is lost, where do we go from here? You know, certainly looking forward to reporting. You kind of what does that look like? So first of all, I wanted to cover something around how for those that are working in teams, how the attitudes of kind of, you know, transpired. What's been the sort of mood and feel within your teams? Matthew, Terry, did you want to go first in sort of helping us explore maybe some of those tribulations you're going through maybe as a team?
The roller coaster of emotions.
Hey guys, yeah, hey guys, what's here?
From a basic operational level, to a certain extent, things haven't changed a great deal. We're 5 people in the team and we all work from home anyway. So from that perspective, it was, from a practical delivery perspective, it was relatively straightforward. We're used to working in our spare bedrooms, you know, or wherever it is that we set up. So that's absolutely fine. I think I'd probably share this with the rest of my team, but that's fine, but getting out and about is really important. Part of the thing that we love about evaluation is that on Monday we're in Yorkshire doing a healthcare evaluation, and then on Tuesday we're in Birmingham doing something entirely different, and then we're down in London. And that actually, it's the variety that makes evaluation such a special practice, such an interesting practice. The 6 months before lockdown, I was doing my expenses, 4,000 miles on the clock in the car. Last 6 months, no miles, and that really hit home. And I'm often on the train as well. That really hit home how much that has affected my work, and the lack of interaction with people, I think, is really missed by the team. I think the other thing that has been quite difficult, I wouldn't say all hope is lost, but we work with charities, and the charity sector has been hit enormously hard. Some of the larger charities we work with, very heavily dependent on charity shops, which have, to all intents and purposes, closed down for months. They've been hit very badly financially. There's a sort of personal issue about what the consequences might be for evaluation projects and contracts down the line, but immediately there's a sense of frustration that evaluation can't necessarily help our clients and the people we work with in this particular moment. We are beginning to, or we are working with clients on strategy work and rethinking what's going to happen next. Quite a lot of work around strategic development, theory of change, some of the principles and models that we know from evaluation, but are more working on structuring the future rather than helping them to react and respond immediately. So I think that's been quite tricky as well.
That's lovely, thank you.
Okay, Tracy, we have a question, sorry, from one of our attendees. And sort of
I noticed that. Yeah, can I just pass this question just to Matthew, and then we'll come back to Rachel's question. Because Matthew, sure. I think the thing around kind of the attitude in teams and having to respond to some of that, I was quite interested, Matthew Horton, around how, as a team, you've responded to that, because you've told us about the challenges of accessing the data, of kind of, does it bother us or does it not with some of the timescales, and your evaluation is slightly different given the secondary data that you have available. So just interesting around the kind of, gosh guys, how are we going to report this? Is this okay? Whether there has been any sort of sense of feeling that there's a bit of shrugged shoulders, and it'll all be okay for the sort of data that you need and the sort of reporting you're doing.
Yeah, I think there's myself and an assistant in my team, so it's quite a small team. There's only 2 of us. In terms of we both commute quite far, so I do about 3 hours a day to work. So we were quite happy about that aspect of working from home. So you get a bit of your day back, which was a bonus. So I think we both enjoyed that aspect. We all meet online as well. There is a wider team as well within the AIMHAR team who do marketing and managers and that. We meet about twice a week. We have coffee mornings, team meetings, just to run through stuff and just have a general chat, see how everyone's getting on. But I suppose the main changes and how it's affected the team and work-wise, we've kind of, like I said, we've had to shift to online evaluation a bit more. Sometimes learning more skills around those areas and looking at different products to use online. But also a focus as well on, we started running coffee mornings with teachers weekly, because they're the gatekeepers really for us to engage pupils in their schools And those coffee mornings were really, really well attended. So when we got to May onwards, there were about 30 plus teachers who attend these coffee mornings. Some of it was a bit of CPD, just around higher education and information and what was going on in terms of the application process. But also we used those coffee mornings to consult as well. So look, this is what we're looking at doing. Is your school going to be open? Are you going to let people in? Would you prefer for online delivery? So before the new term in September, we could plan quite well ahead on what was going on. So it's a bit wider really, not just attitudes around the team, because we did have to change things and everybody was very proactive, but it is attitudes of the wider gatekeepers as well, schools on were they willing to engage, and it varies by school really. Some schools are letting nobody in, other schools are letting people in, some online.
It sounds like you've been
really
very
useful.
Consultative. Yeah, good to be consultative.
Really useful in terms of the planning process really, just to get straight into that. And
lovely,
we have good engagement as well. So but yeah, in terms of the central team, definitely not commuting's a bonus.
I think a lot of people echo that.
Having a jacuzzi in the back garden for lunchtime's quite good as well.
We haven't got to all our panelists for this question, but I am just a little bit conscious of time, and that we have a question also in the open questions, which I cannot see for some reason.
Question. Lauren answered the question, so it's going to ask, but you can sort of ask other panelists as well. So,
by all means, can you ask that question, Hamayoun? Because I've just clicked on a random link and it's pulled away.
Okay, so it's a question sort of from Rachel. That's thinking about evaluation during COVID. Were there any ethical considerations in continuing evaluations during this time? And I suppose sort of put that to Anne first. I suppose sort of ethical issues.
I mean, I mean, we had our ethics in place prior to this. I mean, I think really what I would just say is that, we just had to be mindful of people's sort of experiences, and we certainly weren't doing anything like putting anybody into any danger or anything like that. So I think for us, I mean, I think it's a very important consideration, but I don't think it was a big issue for us in the COVID times now.
Okay, and we're just sort of at the end of our time, but if I'll quickly sort of put it to Adam as well, sort of any sort of ethical issues for evaluation during COVID.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I think actually two of our projects, COVID has had a huge kind of impact in terms of kind of ethics, particularly for one, which was an evaluation for Samaritans. So clearly, the increased mental health and the risk, the fear of kind of suicide, it wasn't right then to carry that on. So that was having to hold it back, really, to report to a certain point. And also another project for Macmillan that we're doing, really looking at end of life in care homes. And again, we had to make the decision relatively early, before the lockdown, that it wasn't right for us to be bombarding care home managers or carers with questions. Actually, they need to focus on their day job. So yeah, that we paused that, and it's kind of resumed to a lighter extent now, and that should resume again in the new year. But ethics is a big consideration.
Thank you. Okay, Tracy, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I noticed that Paul's put a question as well, which is very similar to the ethics around being consultative and that balance between independence and empathy. We are at a time in this panel, but I think that's a fascinating question. It's certainly something that I've researched a little bit into as well, because I do think we have various contestations on what we do, and as we can see in COVID, it's been unexpected, and we we have no manual. We don't know where we're going with coping with this. I'd like to thank hugely our panelists who have been with us for this first panel this morning. We do have a chat function within the webinar, so feel free to kind of ping messages and carry things on. And it sounds like we've got a great panel too.
So with that question as well, so if anyone wants to answer it in there as well, any of the panelists, and if you're able, if you've got time, please do sort of answer that one question as well.
Great. We're going to have a quick comfort break, and then we're resuming again for panel discussion 2 at 11 o'clock. Just a quick comfort break. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Right, well, hello everybody, and welcome back to everyone who joined us for the first panel discussion, and hello to anyone joining us just for the second. Apologies to anyone who's had technical difficulties joining us today, and if you missed the first part of the discussions. The meeting is being recorded, so we will make that available after the event, so you can catch up on anything you missed then. And if you are watching this recording after the event and had trouble joining us on the day, many apologies, and hopefully the recording means you haven't missed out too much. So we'll be starting the second panel discussions shortly. In the first, we reflected a lot on the impact of the pandemic on some live evaluations at the time of the first lockdown, how these were adapted in response. We're now going to turn our attention even further to kind of the future, to reflect on what is yet to come, and how this affects our evaluation work and us as evaluators. So without further ado, I will hand over to George Bramley, who will chair the second of our panel discussions. And if the panelists for the second discussion could also turn their cameras on now. Thank you.
Okay, hi. Can you hear me okay, Carl?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, George.
Okay, great. So we have 3 panelists today. The first one is Laura Amory, who's a business intelligence officer analyst at Birmingham Children's Partnerships. And Laura brings a wealth of experience as a valuation commissioner and has led various research and evaluation projects for the Birmingham Children's Partnership, including a biannual survey aimed at parents and carers with special educational needs and disabilities, and an interim evaluation of the emergency COVID-19 resilience fund for families experiencing financial hardship during the pandemic. I would like to also welcome our old colleague, Michelle Hollier, who's a Director of Research and Evaluation at Winning Move. Michelle brings evaluation practitioner perspective, drawing extensive work across a number of different policy areas and sectors, both in the UK and overseas, and quite a lot of recent evaluation work for the Combined Authority Evaluating Skills programme. And finally, I would like to welcome, from an academic perspective, Mark Hart, who I've worked with for many years, who's a Professor of Small Business Entrepreneurship at Aston Business School and Deputy Director of the Enterprise Research Centre, and is extensively published in the areas of entrepreneurship, enterprise and small business studies. Mark has done numerous evaluations around business support and has developed crazy experimental methods, both used in the UK and Ireland. He jointly manages the global entrepreneurship model, which allows us to benchmark the UK against other countries and within the UK devolved administrations. So so I'd like to work at the 3 panelists. I have a set of questions that I've been would like to ask, and I would like to start with Lauren first. What evaluation questions are you grappling with, and how these changed as a result of the pandemic?
Hi, thanks, George. I think the quick answer to that question, have research questions changed as a result of the pandemic? From my side, no. That would be the quick answer. I write evaluation. I also commission evaluation, and in both of those camps, we are resolutely sticking to the research questions that we would want to know anyway. So we're about to commission an evaluation, quite a large evaluation into a transformation programme. which is for Birmingham Children and Young People's Services, a big change programme worth about 50 million quid over 5 years, and it's the evaluation is of a size that reflects that. We're asking, we're challenging providers to answer the same questions. We want to know the return on investment, we want to know the impact, and certainly having spoken to a few interested providers at a market warming day, there was no indication that those research questions would necessarily be a problem. We were quite impressed at how providers are adapting to the new world, and so people were comfortable with similar research questions. I think the main change from my side is the subject matter of what I'm being asked to evaluate. So I've done an evaluation, for example, of Birmingham's emergency COVID-19 resilience fund, which is like small grants for families in need. And we've helped about 7,000 families in total since April. And so I wouldn't have been asked to evaluate that topic before COVID. I've been pulled into a lot of the work I'm doing, almost all the work I'm doing is about COVID. So it'd be interesting to hear from other panellists about whether that's the case too.
Okay. I'm going to ask the same question for Michelle. How do you think the questions, do you think there has been a change in questions from your perspective, or?
I think from my perspective, it's similar to Lauren really. So the evaluations that we introduced in our video contribution to the showcase there was an evaluation of the devolution of the adult education budget to control by the West Midlands Combined Authority, and then 2 initiatives also delivered by the West Midlands Combined Authority, where they were trying new ways to increase skills and deliver skills programs and meet local employers' skills demands. They were both process, or all of them were process and impact evaluations. So questions were around, are the programs delivering? Are they making a difference to learners? Are they making a difference to employers? And then because they were new ways of going about things, questions around what can be learned about what's working and what's not. I think because they're quite fundamental questions, they've not really changed in light of the pandemic, but there are certainly new additional things of interest. So I think the list of questions has got longer rather than changed. So for the skills programs, obviously things have shifted to an online mode of delivery. So we now have questions about what's the effectiveness of delivering learning online? What effect does learning online have for learners? And a desire to look at the outcomes and impacts of online learning. So, yeah, I would agree with Lauren that for us, the questions have remained kind of unchanged, but there certainly are additional questions coming in.
Mark, from your perspective, have you seen any change in the business support arena in terms of the questions?
Yeah, thanks for that, George. I would agree with Michelle that the questions haven't fundamentally changed at all. I've got about 3 or 4 live evaluations on at the moment in the UK and indeed in France. And the fundamental question that has to be addressed is, look, does this type of intervention work or not? And it goes back to Anne's point at the top of this showcase. It's about context. The context changed. Okay. And secondly, it's about how you do the evaluations, about methodology. One little example, and it goes back to the ethical point that was raised at the end of the last panel. I'm involved in a randomized control trial with the Business Basics program with BAYS, which I think, Michelle, you're very familiar with. We took the view of 6 business schools delivering across England, delivering support, and we on digital adoption in particular, which is what Business Basics is all about. We took the view, and I was adamant about this, that it was not ethical to continue with a randomized control trial in the midst of a pandemic. We were getting up and running in February, March time, and I was arguing with BAYS that we just couldn't do that. The research question was, does business school intervention work? compared to other forms of intervention. So we just couldn't do the RCT. Now, it took a long time for Bayes, for that penny to drop, but it did drop. And then it became one of saying, okay, we'll continue with tech adoption, because again, in the context of a pandemic, it's about being a bit more efficient and agile, flexible about how you run your business. So we actually did not do any selection. We just kept working with the businesses, working with them in terms of tech adoption. So we dropped the RCT side of it, and we actually use it as having conversations with businesses through lockdown and feeding it back into policymakers and Bayes. So, but we're still able to say something about the value of that. We'll still do the evaluation. We just won't have an RCT. But the question remains the same. And again, in the context of work I'm doing in London and Paris, it's about, for JP Morgan, they're looking at their charitable interventions, about business support for underrepresented groups, ethnic minority business owners and women. The question is the same. Does the organizations they're working with improve the chances of survival and sustainability of their businesses? So the questions are the same, but we have to be very careful how we do the work.
Yeah, it's one of the challenges I think is how the data check, discontinuity in the data, because it's been a shock to the system.
I was going to mention that at some stage, George, yes. I mean, for me, it's a fundamental problem. I do a lot of data linking work, and obviously we use that for the administrative data sets. There's a huge lag in the data, so that's a fundamental problem. We weren't allowed to access our offices, so we actually had to delay a lot of that work. We've had to organise with the ONS home access to the secure research service, so it's all been quite complicated. But the data, there's no real live data for us to be continuing that work. We shouldn't be using these types of data anyway for short-term evaluations, but it is a fundamental problem. But I think that, what do you do? How do you attribute the effects of an organization, which is your fundamental question, George, to the wider economic context? I mean, doing evaluations through the great financial crisis gives you some indication of the problems there. But we're in that situation. So we're trying to educate our commissioners of evaluation to say, look, the questions you asked in final quarter 2019, as we got these projects I'm working on up and running, will not be the questions you really need to be asking, in terms of, it's not about, is your financial support working? That's the overall research question, but we can't measure it in terms of the metrics that you would normally expect, like increased revenue, increased productivity, etc., etc. We use different metrics to answer the question. So how valuable was the financial assistance in the case of a project we're doing for the Northern Ireland government? How valuable was it during the pandemic? But then how do you attribute that to Invest NI when you've got Sybil's, when you've got bounce back loans, when you've got everything else that's being thrown out? That is the fundamental mess that the evaluators have to disentangle.
Okay. So that neatly leads me on to my next question, which I'd like to ask Lauren, is what implications has the pandemic and associated measures had for evaluation methodology? What's it been, say, impact on logic models and how we assess causation? Have you been open to new approaches?
Yeah, I mean, not personally, but certainly the stuff I've commissioned, there's had to be an adaptation. We've recently commissioned a piece of ethnography, which I know was raised in the first panel as an area that has had to change. And the strongest bids that came in for the ethnography were those where they'd completely moved online. So some providers were still trying to stick to face-to-face, which we just deemed to be unsafe. So the strongest bids were the ones that had adapted and were using things like digital diaries and apps, ethnography apps, to kind of track people digitally, and also obviously doing a bit of virtual interviewing. I do have a nagging concern about how rich ethnographic data will be in this new world, in this new online world. Because I do wonder whether, you know, are research participants going to be presenting an online persona, as we know can happen, rather than, you know, a researcher shadowing someone, looking at their lived experience. You know, I do have a nagging concern about that, but I was impressed with the adaptation to method, you know, for some of the providers with that. And what Mark raised, my main issue, the work I do on a day-to-day basis, I track data for the city's most vulnerable children, so children in care, children with special educational needs. I look at the data, and as Mark said, there's been this huge impact on trends, which is a worry. You know, why has there been a drop in referrals to Birmingham Children's Trust, etc.? It's concerning. Why are children not presenting in emergency departments with injury? Things that might usually you'd think, oh, that's quite a good thing, is a concern because we've had this big drop off in trend.
Okay, we could probably come back to the issue of trends because that is a baseline thing. So, Michelle, what approaches have you been introducing in response to new data concerns and new methodologies?
Yeah, I think some of the challenges with the work that Winning Moves are currently doing, and certainly the evaluations that we put forward for the showcase, is that there aren't any trends. So, and the challenge there is trying to disaggregate the effect of the pandemic from everything else that's going on. So I think there's probably two things that evaluators are looking at now. There are programs that have been delivered in response to the pandemic, and then there are other programs that have been adapted in light of the pandemic, and most of what we are doing sort of falls into that second category. But I think, as I alluded to earlier, a number of things we're looking at right now, like these programs for the combined authority, are new initiatives or new ways of doing things. So our challenge there is to understand if things do or don't work, how far is that down to the pandemic, or how far is that down to other contextual factors, program design, program management? And that's the kind of mess, to use Mark's term, that we need to try and unpick. And I have to say, I don't really have a kind of solution, but I think logic models are helpful, and we have used that in our work for the combined authority, because we can really then think about which elements are really affected by the pandemic and be extra sensitive around data and analysis in those areas. I have talked to colleagues and some clients. I think there's a bit of concern in my mind that if things don't work at the moment, that the pandemic will be cited as the cause of that failure, and that might be sort of a convenient narrative when there might, you know, it's not necessarily that. There are other things going on, and just being really sensitive to that.
Okay, because there's a sort of issue about new programs coming online very quickly, and it's sometimes and you don't have the speed to actually really understand the logic models and the program theory behind them.
Yeah,
we're sort of going to use this as a sort of segue to Mark, in the sense that some of the schemes that you might be coming out, or questions coming out, might be adaptations of previous schemes. There might be capital around approaches there, but how have you managed to adapt your existing methodologies to evaluate new schemes? And
well, I think it's important that you know the easiest thing is to take our standard methodologies and walk in with two big hobnail boots and insist on using our standard questions. We have to be sensitive to where, in my world, where businesses are at the moment. So it's a question of making sure that they have a voice about their views on the pandemic. So we have to, if we want business owners to participate in our self-reported questionnaires or other forms of interaction, then I think we have to give them a voice. And certainly most of my work is for government as opposed to private sector. It's about saying, look, it's really valuable that you give us your feedback. But I think from the point of view of, how we get to what works, which is the fundamental problem in business support. It's making sure, well, I would go back to your first question, George, and say, look, it's important we recalibrate any existing logic model. We work with the client and we say, look, what do you expect of the outcomes and impact to be are going to be different because the context changed. Now, the inputs and outputs are probably much the same. The output is, basically someone turned up to an online training session, they got X, Y, Z in terms of advice, support, money, whatever. But I think the outcome and the impact is where we need to be concentrating our efforts. What is it the client expects given the context? The problem you've then got is any value for money calculations, net present value calculations. So the work I'm doing in Northern Ireland, for example, that, obviously the finance department is looking at that and saying, yes, but can you do some cost benefit? Can you do some net present value? And I'm saying no, because essentially what are you asking me to do? All I can say is that at the moment, the intervention in 2020 is proving to be extremely valuable to businesses. What we can perhaps do is using admin data, look at the period we're looking at is 2014 to 2020, 21. And what we can do is actually stop the evaluation using admin data in 2019. So therefore stripping out the effects of pandemic, but we can't actually interview firms, because you get what Michelle has said, this sort of, what's in a business owner's mind when they're talking to you. Yeah. Well, obviously the pandemic's in their mind, the performance of their businesses in their mind, what's happening with their employees and their suppliers and their customers, etc. So you have to try and, manage expectations, perhaps roll back to life before pandemic in terms of your data point. And then obviously in the context of talking to firms at the moment is trying to work out in the context of this year, has the support of a business advisor, an account manager in terms of, say, Scottish Enterprise. There's another project we're working on. So it's about being sensitive. Anne nailed it at the beginning. It's about context as a value. We just got to do that, and we've got to change our methodologies. But
yeah, because sometimes those interviews, it's changing the line of question, isn't it?
It is.
And you
Absolutely.
can't. And doing the value for money stuff, you might come up with a creative way of doing it, but it's not going to be comparable.
Well, the point is you want to compare across programs, you want to compare historically, and therefore all of that is thrown up in the air. So it's about basically saying to the client, look, we can't do this. Yeah. As you said, George, there's a huge discontinuity in the data. Therefore, we need to be very careful what it is we're evaluating here. If you want intelligence about how your clients are performing compared to a control group of non-clients, how they're coping and how your interventions are being helpful or not, that's fine. We can do that. Yeah. But these higher level things which most people in Treasury are wanting to see, we just cannot do in the way that you would have done them a year ago. Mm-hmm. Totally unhelpful contribution, George, I know, but
we can continue it afterwards. It would be, Lauren, what would be the practical implications from your perspective as a commissioner? Because sometimes, having been a commissioner, you're the piggy in the middle. And you have to translate what your policy colleagues want, get into a spec, and then say what you think is a sensible set of questions for an evaluator to ask, and then put it out. What has been the practical implications in?
Yeah, I mean, there's always that balance, isn't there, in terms of asking sensible research questions that meet everybody's objectives and agendas. That hasn't changed. That was still the process that I went through for the evaluation we're about to commission. What did change, though, on a practical level, because of COVID, we did have to reduce our budgets for the evaluation. I don't mind telling you, because there is this imperative to channel funding to emergency frontline services, and I work in the public sector. I'm funded by the NHS, by the council, and these are really stretched organisations, so necessarily we could not be seen to be investing a huge amount of money in an evaluation, to be honest, which was a shame. But we tried to adapt by saying, okay, well, we'll reduce our evaluation in terms of time and budget, but we will give ourselves the option to extend that time and that budget at a later date, hopefully. You know, we've got a clause to say, yes, we can extend our evaluation by a further couple of years.
Yeah.
And hopefully when everything's settled down.
Yeah, because it's a classic thing you can do. One of the challenges is where it's about resource reallocation. And if you have to do quick in-time informing stuff. The other thing is where you're suggesting that the way of getting a better evaluation is make it long, thin, and potentially cheap because it's not as concentrated resource over time.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be a fair reflection.
I also wonder, something that at the back of my mind is that reduction in budget something that we're seeing? Is there going to be increased competition for evaluation tenders? You know, I'd be really interested to hear from other people about what they're experiencing in terms of, you know, are we seeing evaluation coming to the fore, or are we seeing evaluations a bit thin on the ground?
I think there could be challenges in terms of how different organisations' cost structures are set up. So certain organisations will struggle because they have a lot of on costs of built-in organisational costs potentially. So we might see a change in who applies.
Yeah.
That's an interesting point, George. I mean, just to follow up to that from Lauren, I mean, I think that one of the problems I'm having with our small organisations in London and Paris at the moment is, you know, trying to strip back the series of questions that you'd want to see. You know what evaluators are like, George. We want to put the kitchen sink in. Whereas organisations are saying, look, we don't want you. Can you actually do this in bite-sized chunks for the businesses? Mm-hmm. So instead of doing a survey with the usual 4 or 5 sections, whatever, they say, look, you know, can we give you a lot of this data from our own data? Can you ask them 1 or 2 questions, and we'll give you access to them over a longer period of time between now and Christmas? So rather than doing a larger survey in September, we sort of spread it out a wee bit. And that's problematic because the client says no, because we're launching in Washington. This is JP Morgan. We're launching a report next year. We need the data. And I'm saying, yeah, well, but yet on the ground, you know, organizations are very nervous about giving data to evaluators when they've built up a relationship with that. You know, we are not their priority. Yeah. You know, they're working with ethnic groups and refugees in Paris, for example. You know, and that, can you imagine that access to that group, you know, is problematic in any normal context, never mind a pandemic. It's about trust, and I think that was a great point that was made in the earlier panel as well. So there's all these sort of issues, and I think, you know, I think the phrase you used was, you know, a thin evaluation in terms of budget, but perhaps that works just as well in terms of spreading out some of the information that we might need.
Yeah, because the classic approach we used to adopt was when we did things like the business link evaluation, was we do the big survey.
Oh yes, I remember
that way you could do it quickly, which is my segue effectively onto Michelle, because we used to ask her to do these big surveys to capture data. So can you say a little bit about challenges that you've had in data collection and other approaches that you've adopted?
Yeah, so I would say it's quite different for different audiences. Yes. So, and I saw sort of a question in the chat about this. I think we found that with consumers, or what we would call consumers or householders or non-domestic, or domestic, sorry, we've actually seen higher response rates on a number of projects that we've done repeatedly than we've had before, both for online and for telephone methods. And we were slightly apprehensive, but we did some consumer interviews sort of April, May time, didn't know how they would go, but found that audience very receptive to, you know, they were at home, they wanted things to do. They were also maybe more engaged, the sort of maybe more politically engaged. With a lot of our work we do is on behalf of government, public sector funded organisations. So people have a lot of opinions about government and public sector organisations right now very keen to share. So that group we've found to be very responsive. We've also found incentives. I know there was discussion of incentives in the first panel to work quite well with that group, sort of charitable donations in particular. With businesses, completely the opposite effect. And if you asked me to do a massive survey for Business Link tomorrow, I would say that would be very, very difficult, George. I think with what we're finding is with telephone surveys, which is a methodology that we use a fair bit, it's very difficult to actually find the person that you want to interview. So you often don't have direct dials in the databases that you use. So what you're doing is you're calling up a business number, and then they don't have the telephony systems in the working from home scenario to pass you through to the person you want. Also finding lots of people on furlough, which means that you might want to speak to someone that's actually furloughed, or businesses are just trying to survive, and a research conversation is difficult. And even online, it's difficult because so many things are moving online. And I know myself, but for others, you're getting this sort of bombardment. So it's been quite split, really, in terms of respondent types.
I'm going to sort of, before I go back to the panel, I'm going to sort of like raise the question that Rachel McGuire's. We've all been asked to evaluate programs at unclear objectives and inability to articulate logic models. How in some cases doable pre-COVID projects and keeping evaluation very open, exploratory, how without in-person work, it feels much more difficult. Can the panel give some advice around that? I'm not sure if I actually got around dealing with unclear objectives. So, Mark?
I mean, I think that, when we do our face-to-face interviews as a follow-up to, say, a major survey or whatever, you can use that time to really get around the sort of the edges of what it is that's happening in the business, what it is about the interaction with the business support. And I think that, it's an iterative process. Sometimes when you talk to beneficiaries of a program, you get a clear idea of what their first contact was with the organization delivering support, and therefore you can actually use that to go back and write a new logic model actually for the organization. So yeah, I think we are losing out, Rachel, a lot, in terms of the nuances of how programs actually work. Yeah. But I think it's about how I've done a lot of, interviews and consultations on Zoom, whatever software we use, and it's just not the same. And, it's really important that, you're losing a lot, because, when you're sitting in someone's office, so, you can actually begin to, move conversations in different ways, whereas on the video conference you feel you're very, very time limited. When you know yourself, George, when you go for a half-hour interview, it stretches to an hour, whereas on the video conference everybody books their video conferences in 30-minute slots, and it's back to back, and it is more difficult. I think we're missing a lot of that subjective understanding of how a program's working, which was never picked up in a questionnaire.
And the other challenge is that you have your topic guide and you have to have more of a conversation.
Yes.
You have to follow
yeah.
your original thing. You have to retrospectively get to the questions, I found.
Yeah, and it's a skill, and it's an acquired skill over many years. And, the evaluation industry is, perhaps needs to be thinking about how it trains its evaluators to actually conduct more of this online. I mean, the point that was made, I think it was Adam, about 4,000 miles a year and no more train travel. I mean, this is the new world, because why are we doing that? We need to improve our techniques for gathering the same sort of information through other means. So, we're doing consultation work at the moment, and what I do is book a series of interviews rather than one.
Yeah.
So I would do it, a check-in on a Thursday afternoon to avoid Mondays and Fridays. Just to say, look, can I have 15 minutes to catch up? And I want to talk about this. So I chop the topic guide up into bits.
Yeah.
And you get more people prepared to talk to you. And you get more, and then it's a focused 15 minutes on a particular set of questions. And then, in between, you're sort of reflecting and being able to go back the next time with a little bit more, perhaps, rather than reacting on your feet, you're actually, building a more iterative topic guide, which I find has been quite useful in this project.
And that's very good for human factors in the sense that people get much more exhausted much more quickly on a video conference meeting.
I do agree with that, actually. It's 11:30, George, and I'm ready for my siesta,
So I must admit, I do find doing interviews by video conference sometimes less exhausting than by telephone.
Oh gosh, yes, that is absolutely the case.
Okay, so I'm conscious that we're moving towards the end of our slot. So I'm going to ask Lauren, how does you think the role of evaluations have changed or will change as a result of the pandemic, or as a result of innovations in public services that have come about as a result of the pandemic, and why?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, in the short term, in my world, a lot of new services have been accelerated, have been brought in really, really quickly, kind of triggered by the pandemic. So, for example, we've launched locality early help teams led by the voluntary and community sector, who are kind of calling families up, offering support. And it took a matter of weeks to get this service up and running. Whereas I think prior to COVID, it would have taken months, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So I think the role of evaluators is actually, I think there's an opportunity for evaluators to basically document, all these new services, the impact of these new services, to disaggregate the impact of COVID in terms of outcomes for children and young people and the wider community. I think there are opportunities for evaluators. And I think it's going to be incredibly challenging as evaluators because policymakers are looking to us to tell them what's happening socially and economically, and to say, okay, disaggregate the impact of COVID on on data, and say, okay, this so for example, social care demand, if there's been a drop off in terms of social care referrals. How much of that is due to, for example, school closures?
Yeah.
But also how much of that is due to the new early help service? And it's just that kind of disaggregation, which I haven't got the answer to, but I think there are opportunities for evaluators to work with policymakers to document what's happening.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned social services, because we did a study in the Marches, and because of COVID-19, some of the regulations that stopped innovations happening were relaxed. I'm not quite sure.
Sorry, say that again.
Right, in sort of like health and social care services, there's been a lot more innovation or introduction of new technologies because some of the regulations around adoptions of technologies have been relaxed.
Yeah, and similarly, there was a relaxation of data sharing.
Yeah.
In health and social care, which really opened up the possibilities of starting something quickly.
Yeah, and that has profound implications for what you can do, because evaluations can stall for a while in data share agreements.
Yeah.
Michelle, how do you think your role has adapted or changed as a result of, or might change going forward?
So I think we've talked about a few things both in this session and the previous one. Obviously the move to online ways of delivery, this additional sensitivity to people's personal circumstances. And I think two things we haven't perhaps talked about that I've noticed is one is staying much closer to the client, both to what they are delivering, but also, for want of a better word, the mood of the program, for example. So I think with sort of unlike other events, which you can put in inverted commas, like an election, a referendum, a program or policy response to that is a sort of a one-off. Things are adapted, the mood changes, but then it remains, both things remain relatively stable. What we're seeing here is something that's really dynamic. So programs are adapting incrementally, and moods are changing, daily. So staying very close, and I think that'll be the same for a while. So staying very close to both in terms of how the program's adapting, so you're sort of following that through, as Lauren says, but also the mood in terms of so for the work we're doing with the combined authority, it's really useful to know when are targets changing, when are training providers under pressure because of something that the combined authority is asking them to do, when are they which particular providers might be struggling with something, because then we can make sure that's reflected both in the way that we approach people, when we approach people, and that feels very different in terms of the way you might work. I think the other thing is in terms of methods, and thinking about sort of the kind of the sort of complex appropriate methods might sort of play more of a role going forward in as Lauren talks about, and I've mentioned that sort of disaggregation of the impact of COVID, those methods may start to play a stronger role in areas maybe, or sort of policy areas that they maybe haven't before, as a kind of a way of trying to unpick and understand that, the impact of the pandemic versus other contextual factors or program design or management. So they're two things I think will sort of change going forward.
Okay. And some final sage words from Mark on the future role of evaluators.
I think it's well, obviously, as you know, that it's really, I see evaluation as core to everything that private public sector do in terms of interventions, whether it's with in terms of poverty, in terms of business support, etc., etc. But I think we've learned a lot of lessons in the last, certainly I have, since the start of the year, in terms of how we go about it. I think there's a lot more iteration with people commissioning evaluations in terms of the way in which, what is it, there's a bit more discussion about, what is it you really need to know? In some cases, it's about how, what is the key question that the people who are allocating money say in JP Morgan to the charity to do these interventions, what is it about, what is it you need to be able to show, so that there's more discussion, George, and there's more interaction with the client, I've found. The way we design our questionnaires has changed fundamentally. It's, I think, as I said before, it's about keeping it short and sweet and not getting carried away. Time is precious for a lot of businesses. And I think that, I go back to the point about RCTs. It is the gold standard in business support world, and across all evaluation areas. But in my world, I think it's quite difficult to be randomly selecting businesses for support at a time of economic and social crisis. And I think that was my first point at the start of this session, and I think we need to give that some serious consideration, because I was not comfortable, my university from a reputational point of view was not comfortable rationing access to support from a business school, simply because we wanted to find out and get answers through the RCT methodology. So I think this has called into question, I think, the clamour for RCTs, yes, but context is everything. Anne's point from 10 o'clock is just as valid. So I think we as evaluators need to be very careful about that going forward.
I think there is a challenge around RCTs. One is around maintaining fidelity of the programme.
Yeah.
Use a medical term. And having worked in systematic reviews where you're looking at RCTs for interventions around supporting mothers around pregnancy and things like that, when you look at the RCT design in the end, you're trying to aggregate across them. The designs don't make sense because they've been designed to fit around the RCT. I don't know what extent you had that challenge, because to do an RCT type intervention, you put constraint or artificial boundaries. I don't know if you're encountering.
Yeah, I think it is. But I mean, I had problems with RCTs before economic crisis. Let's be clear. I mean, there are issues there, but I think in particular it has sharpened the dilemmas you've got where you're. I mean, one of the interesting things was we actually said to the businesses what was early February, look, we did a first workshop and then we did the randomization for the more intensive support. And we just set it out to them, and I was keen to know their reaction. They said, well, actually, we're actually grateful for this free half-day workshop. What you do with us afterwards, we actually don't mind. But can you please make sure I'm in the selected pot, was what they said as they left the room. But yeah, I just leave that point there, George. I think that the pandemic has taught us that we can actually improve our game.
Yeah.
And yes, we've got difficulties, but I think that we need to advance the industry of evaluation and learn the lessons of 2020.
Yeah. So on that point, I'm going to just check whether there's any questions upon the Q&A, and there doesn't appear to. So I'd like to thank Lauren, Mark and Michelle for their contributions to this panel session and move on to the next item, Carl.
Thanks very much, George. If I may, I think we've just got a couple of minutes left. So just ask one further question to the panelists if they're happy to stay on. Sorry. And it's just one that's just out of interest. Obviously, we've discussed a lot of changes that people have made in response to the pandemic and ways evaluation work has changed and also ways it hasn't. I'd just be interested to hear a little bit about changes that have happened that you'd like to keep when this is all over, and perhaps those things that you'd like to go back to what you were doing before as soon as possible. So that to Michelle, perhaps, first of all.
Yeah, I think personally, I think a bit of all working together in a room, that's what I miss sometimes, is that creativity that you get when you're working with colleagues, and I just can't seem to recreate that online. So kind of looking forward to that. I think what has seemed to work well, I think, is that we're working more closely with clients than we have before. I think also even clients that historically I used to talk to on the telephone, now I talk to on video, and somehow, being in each other's homes has made it there's much more of a shared understanding, but all going through the same thing. I think there's a stronger connection there. You're building better relationships, more open relationships. You can have more candid discussion. Some clients I've talked to for 2 years on the phone and then got to know them much better in 3 months of video calls than I ever did in 2 years, and that's led to better kind of working relationships and work. So I think that's something valuable to keep. But yeah, really keen to have some actual personal interaction in the office, I think.
Yeah,
I'm doing my business evaluations. I really do miss getting out and about on the premises of a business. I really do miss that. And it's, it's what I was saying earlier about that conversation when you're out and about, that you can actually get an understanding of what's going on, but also just seeing what businesses do. It's what I've always done, and I really do miss that. So I will rush back to that with glee.
And Lauren.
Yeah, I think I'd like to get my work-life balance back. I don't know if everybody else feels that it's been very pressured work-wise this year in the NHS and public sector. But what I have noticed is, I think as a report writer, working from home is actually really good because I can switch my email off and I've got complete silence to write a report, which is great. I also think because of this crisis, the boundaries between agencies in the public sector have sort of melted away a little bit. And it's kind of similar to what Michelle was saying, that sense of cooperation for the common good. It's almost like camaraderie in wartime or something, it feels like, where we're getting better cooperation across agencies. So whereas I would request a bit of data or a bit of help, and it might not be coming, certainly during the pandemic, everybody's been working together really, really positively, I think. And it would be great to see that continue.
That's great. Yes, I'm sure we're very keen for all this to be over and to be getting back to things. But it's interesting that it's led to some changes that we all would like to keep as well. So, yes. So thanks from me now for all your time that you've spent in advance of the sessions today, and obviously your contributions today. Thanks to Lauren, Michelle, Mark, and to George there for chairing. I'd now like to hand over, I think, to Matthew Terry and Tracy Wand again. I think they'd like to say a few words about the UK Evaluation Society and forthcoming events. Matthew.
Yeah, Tracy might be better on forthcoming events. I was just going to say something about the UK Evaluation Society for people who don't know it. I'm a council member of the UK Evaluation Society. Tracy is as well. I'd encourage people to join. It's a very friendly organisation. This sort of discussion is just the sort of discussion that we have regularly within the society. It's an organisation that promotes and improves, aims to promote and improve theory, practice and understanding of evaluation. It's open to anyone who's interested in evaluation. You don't have to describe yourself as an evaluator in order to join. And we do an awful lot of things. We traditionally have a conference every year. That's a bit, on the back burner at the moment because of COVID. We have a range of other activities. We have regional groups, training courses, and I also coordinate a professional development scheme for those who are seeking to improve their own evaluation practice through a more structured professional development approach, and that's available for members as well. Tracy.
Yeah, hi. Yes, so I'm also a council member and currently treasurer of the UK Evaluation Society. You'll see there's some adverts out at the moment if you follow our Twitter for new council members and some senior roles, including vice president and my role as treasurer. Being treasurer is great, isn't it, George? But I've had my 2-year term now. There's also an event coming up, which is quite a big event for us, really, because I'd say it supplements the conference. In some ways, it's a bit of a replacement that we can't meet this year, but it will be obviously an online event, and that's for a week-long lunchtime event, 23rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th of November, and that's available to book on the UK Evaluation Society website. The website you'll find, and you've probably seen it before, is evaluation.org. .uk, but if you go onto there and head into our events section, we've got a lot of events, including the Windows on Evaluation Matters event that I've just mentioned. So that's a bit of a headline event. We've got the likes of Nick Tilley there, many others. I won't name them. For me, I'm sort of like, hey, Nick Tilley's there, but there's lots and lots and lots of great speakers there, so have a little look at the lineup yourself. We also have a lot of CCAN led courses at the moment. Systematic reviews to evaluation we're kind of selling them like hotcakes at the moment. A lot of people are interested in these systematic reviews, so have a look at the CCAN led events that are available to book there too, because there's quite a lot. I've not really seen the UKS have so many events kind of lined up, so it's quite an exciting time at the moment with lots of activity happening, albeit sad not to see everybody's faces in real life. But yeah, just head over to our events section, you'll find them all there.
Great.
I do sales, Carl. This feels weird. do sales.
Sorry, thanks, Tracy. Great. So I think just a few final words before we close. If you aren't connected with the Midlands Regional Network already, you can join our LinkedIn group, the details of which should be on your screen now. You can also alternatively get in touch with me via email, and I can get you invited to that group and add you to our mailing list if you'd like to hear about future events. A recording of this session, as I mentioned earlier, will be made available on the Midlands Showcase website, where you can also view Showcase contributions from some of our panellists if you've yet to do so and would like to hear a little bit more about some of the evaluation work that's been mentioned today. And obviously, as Tracy says, do keep a lookout for other events organised by the UK Evaluation Society, and do consider becoming a member. Obviously, an action-packed programme this month with something for everyone. So please do take a look at that and register. And you can view upcoming events by visiting the UK Evaluation Society website, which there's also a link to there, or by following the Society on Twitter as well, because most of the events are advertised there. So I think that brings everything to a close, and all that remains for me to say is a big thank you again to all of our panellists and our chairs for the discussions today, and to you and to all that have attended, and the questions and for your questions that you've posed to our panel. And we look forward to connecting with you again at future events, and hopefully some in-person events as well in 2021. Thank you very much.